Two political advisors join us, as does our regular political analysis team of Gergen and Shields. Then, is it okay to say a prayer at a school graduation ceremony? We have a Kwame Holman report on the story and the issues behind the case that today reached the Supreme Court. And the new federal guidelines on food labeling. The man behind them, Food and Drug Administrator David Kessler, talks to Charlene Hunter-Gault.
Funding for the NewsHour has been provided by AT&T. AT&T has supported the MacNeil Lehrer NewsHour since 1983 because quality information and quality communications is our idea of a good connection. AT&T, the right choice. And by PepsiCo. And by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. And by the financial support of viewers like you.
The nation's central bank took action today to jumpstart the stalled economy. The Federal Reserve Board cut the trend-setting discount rate half a point to 4.5%. It also added funds to the nation's banking system in an effort to promote easier credit. The discount rate is what Fed charges the commercial banks for loans, and it now stands at an 18-year low. The move prompted several major banks to lower their prime lending rates to business borrowers from 8 to 7.5%. Banks use the prime as a benchmark for a wide range of other loans, including some types of mortgages. This morning, President Bush was asked if he was concerned about another recession. He spoke at the White House before the Fed's action.
No, I'm not worried about it sliding into recession. I am worried about consumer confidence because I think when you look at historically low interest rates, a lot of people will suddenly wake up and say this is a good time to buy a home, a good time to buy a car. But I worry about it. Of course I do. There ought to be, in my view, given the economic place where we stand now, more confidence. I'm not trying to say everything is rosy, but I am saying interest rates are down. There is a good chance to do something now in the way of housing or in cars or in whatever that we haven't had before. And so I think it'll come around, but of course I worry about it.
Later, Democratic Senator Lloyd Bentsen of Texas blamed the economic policies of the Bush and Reagan administrations for the lack of consumer confidence. He said the Senate Finance Committee, which he chairs, would begin work on a major tax cut proposal aimed at reversing the situation. The measure is co-sponsored by Republican Senator William Roth of Delaware. Bentsen spoke on Capitol Hill.
It's no wonder that consumer confidence is lagging. And it's certainly not news that the economy won't turn around until it's restored. So we're today introducing legislation to give a tax break to middle-income families with children. Our legislation would give these families a tax credit of $300 for every child under the age of 19. And that would reduce income taxes for a family making $35,000 a year, would reduce that by 25%, reduce it by a quarter. That would not only help build consumer confidence, it would boost our economy in other ways, too.
Bentsen said he didn't think the legislation could be completed before the end of this congressional session, but he said it was important to get the process underway. Judy?
There was an upset in yesterday's race for the U.S. Senate seat from Pennsylvania. Democratic Senator Harris Wofford beat the Republican former U.S. Attorney General Dick Thornburgh, winning 55% of the vote to Thornburgh's 45%. Wofford was appointed to the seat in April after Republican Senator John Hines died in a plane crash. Opinion polls at the start of the race had shown him 44 percentage points behind the better-known Thornburgh, who was also a former governor of Pennsylvania. Elsewhere, voters in the state of Washington rejected a measure to limit the terms of elected officials. They also rejected an initiative to permit doctor-assisted suicide. On another election still ahead, President Bush today went further than he has in the past to separate himself from David Duke, the Republican candidate for governor in Louisiana. Duke faces former Democratic Governor Edwin Edwards in a runoff election November 16th. Mr. Bush said Duke, who was once a Ku Klux Klan leader, did not deserve one iota of public trust.
When someone has a long record, an ugly record of racism and of bigotry, that record simply cannot be erased by the glib rhetoric of a political campaign. So I believe that David Duke is an insincere charlatan. I believe he's attempting to hoodwink the voters of Louisiana, and I believe that he should be rejected for what he is and what he stands for.
Later, the president told reporters that he would cast his vote for the Democrat Edwards if he were a Louisiana voter.
The federal government today announced new and tougher food labeling standards. The sweeping new rules will affect more than 250,000 food labels from some 77,000 manufacturers. Labeled terms such as light and low calorie will have to fit strict definitions. Lean will mean 10% or less fat, and fresh will be allowed only on raw food. The rules were announced by Food and Drug Administration Commissioner David Kessler. Dr. Kessler will join us for more on this story later in the program.
The House of Representatives today voted to overturn last May's Supreme Court ruling on abortion counseling. The court had upheld a Reagan administration ban on such counseling at federally funded clinics. President Bush has threatened to veto any attempt to reverse the ban. Today's vote fell short of the 2/3 needed to override a veto, in part because of separate budget problems with the bill that several members said led them to split off from the majority.
Fighting flared again today in Yugoslavia's Croatian Republic, shattering another ceasefire. The heaviest battles were in the Adriatic port of Dubrovnik. The historic city has been under siege by central government forces for more than a month. Paul Davies of Independent Television News is there and filed this report.
Any hope that the European community's latest call for peace would halt the fighting disappeared as a fierce battle raged around the ancient city. Its residents, who had enjoyed a relatively quiet 24 hours, fled for the shelters, as from their mountaintop positions overlooking the city, Federal Army guns shelled Dubrovnik. The first target appeared to be the Croatian fort alongside the television mast on top of Mount Surge. The fortress hit and set ablaze. The guns were then directed at the city suburbs. Shells and mortars falling on residential areas. We saw several apartment blocks hit in a sustained attack that lasted more than 3 hours. If the Serbian-dominated army was hoping to destroy the Croatians' hidden gun positions, most of their shells fell on houses. As dozens of homes burnt, shells were also landing just in front of Dubrovnik's hilltop hospital. The city also came under fire from a Federal Navy gunboat patrolling the waters just a few hundred yards offshore. It was the most sustained bombardment in weeks, leaving the latest European attempt to broker a ceasefire in tatters.
Flash flooding and landslides triggered by a tropical storm killed at least 2,400 people in the Philippines. Officials said 1,500 more were missing and 50,000 were left homeless. Almost all of the dead were in a single city 250 miles south of Manila. The storm hit the islands yesterday, but knocked out communications, made it impossible to determine the scope of the disaster until today. In Kuwait, there was a celebration marking an official end to the oil fire disaster. Kuwait's emir pushed a lever extinguishing what was supposed to be the last of the fires set by retreating Iraqi soldiers 9 months ago. In fact, 2 wells are still burning, but more than 700 other fires have been put out months ahead of schedule.
Basic goods such as bread and meat will soon be rationed in the capital of the Soviet Union. Moscow's mayor announced the new plan today. He said the goods would be rationed at low prices beginning December 1st. Prices are expected to rise sharply early next year when government controls are lifted. That's it for our summary of the day's news. Just ahead on the NewsHour, the political fallout from yesterday's elections, school prayer back in the high court, and no more fudging on food labels.
Both parties are claiming victories in yesterday's off-year elections. Republicans won big in Mississippi, Virginia, and New Jersey. But Democrats claim the day's biggest prize was theirs, the Senate seat in Pennsylvania. We'll start our political analysis tonight with a look at that upset. Democrat Harris Wofford overcame a 47-point deficit to trounce former 2-time governor and U.S. Attorney General Dick Thornburgh by a margin of 55 to 45%.
Your first Democratic senator in 23 years reported for duty.
For Democrat Harris Wofford, the Senate race in Pennsylvania was a political fairy tale. A neophyte and long-shot candidate, Wofford rallied from what looked like certain defeat to upset the former two-term governor and U.S. Attorney General Dick Thornburgh.
This election has been about more than electing one senator for Pennsylvania. It's about sending a message from Pennsylvania. I'm lucky once again, I'm lucky to be the messenger. But the message is that it's time for change in this country.
Wofford's message during the campaign emphasized economic reforms aimed at the middle class, jobs, and national health insurance.
The Constitution says those accused of a crime have the right to a lawyer, yet millions of Americans aren't able to see a doctor. They either don't have health insurance or they're afraid medical costs will bankrupt them. If criminals have the right to a lawyer, I think working Americans should have the right to a doctor.
The issue caught fire with the voters, and by the end of last week, Wofford had closed the gap in the polls and put Thornburgh on the defensive. In his concession speech last night, Thornburgh acknowledged the appeal of the health care issue to the voters.
Including the uncertainty and anxiety about the cost and coverage of health care obviously commanded much greater attention in this campaign than we anticipated.
Wofford went further and said his campaign was a referendum on the failed policies of Washington.
The people of Pennsylvania on this one glorious day have used the power of the ballot to send a wake-up call to the president, to the Congress, to the Republican Party, to the entire federal establishment.
There were signs this morning that Washington heard that call. Before departing for a NATO meeting in Rome, President Bush said he'd received the message.
I just take Senator Wofford at his word that there's a message here for the administration and a message here for the United States Congress. And I think people, when the economy is slow, people are concerned. They're hurting out there. They're concerned about their livelihood. He got a big hand for saying he wants to help on those whose benefits have run out. So do I.
The president also announced that he would be canceling his Asian trip later this month, so he could keep an eye on Congress during the final days of its session. To some Washington observers, that decision was an even clearer indication that the Senate race in Pennsylvania had left its mark on Pennsylvania Avenue. Joining us now to explain what happened in Pennsylvania and what, if any, are the lessons for 1992 are Paul Begala, the Wofford campaign manager. He joins us from the studios of public station WHYY in Philadelphia. In Washington is Ed Rollins, the 1984 Reagan-Bush campaign director. He was also the political director in the Reagan White House and later co-chairman of the National Republican Congressional Committee. He's now a political consultant. Ed Rollins, as a Republican strategist, what do you think happened in Pennsylvania, and what message should it send to the White House?
Well, obviously, the voters of Pennsylvania proved yesterday that the American voters are not going to coronate anybody. I think Dick Thornburgh is a very fine guy, underestimated this campaign, ran a totally inept campaign, and I think that Senator Wofford, who is not as effective a campaigner, ran a brilliant campaign with a very good message.
And the message being what?
The message was that Washington's out of tune with where the American voters are today, and that many of the subjects that he raised in the course of the campaign are things that people in Pennsylvania, I think across the country, want addressed. That's the economy, that's health care, and obviously politicians of both parties have to answer those. There are other defeats around the country that I think made the day not a partisan day, but a bipartisan day, and that is that anybody can be defeated if they don't address what the voters are talking about today.
Paul Begala, how do you describe what happened in your state?
Well, it was less a function of mechanics than it was of message and of action. Washington hasn't taken action on a variety of issues that middle-class people want action on, and Senator Wofford spoke to those needs and concerns. Frankly, I think if Mr. Thornburgh had run a technically perfect campaign, the fact still would have been that for 11 years now, the Republicans in Washington have run this country and they've done nothing about health care or a variety of other middle-class issues.
Tell me, Mr. Begala, what data did you have or what insight induced you to focus so much on health care when all the conventional polls have been telling us that it's a marginal concern. I mean, people would say they're concerned about it, but when you asked them to list all the things they were concerned about, it was coming quite far down the list.
Well, it was really Senator Wofford who hit on it before he was appointed to the Senate. He was Secretary of Labor and Industry here in Pennsylvania, and he saw that in almost every labor management dispute that he addressed for 5 years, the issue of health insurance was the top issue. And so when he was first appointed, long before he even had a pollster, he was talking about going to Washington with a message on health insurance and other middle-class issues, like a tax cut that Senator Benson was talking about earlier in your program.
Ed Rollins, do you think politicians have been misreading the polling data on this health care issue?
I certainly do. I think there's an awful lot of Americans who are very concerned about the high cost of health care, let alone the 37 million who do not have any sort of health insurance. It's one of the scary things that's out there in people's lives. I don't think it's the foremost issue. The foremost issue, obviously, the economy, but it is an uncertainty, and it was reinforced very ably by the campaign.
Do you think the polling, when it asks people to list what really concerns them, doesn't get it right?
I think polling today is totally irrelevant to the process. Obviously, a 44-point lead that Dick Thornburg had meant nothing yesterday. A 17-point lead that Michael Dukakis had after the convention meant nothing. The American voters are very fluid today, and they're making up their minds late, and there are lots of different things that'll move them. You've got 40% of the American voters today that are really independent voters who are going to vote for the man or the message or the woman of the message, and not just for the party. A lot of times when you poll, people relate to name identification and not to how they're actually going to vote in the final analysis.
Mr. Begala, one of the criticisms of your senator's campaign by the opposition was that he was just talking in nice generalities about the need for better health care. Do you take the vote now to mean that there is some kind of citizen mandate, at least in Pennsylvania, for the adoption of a radical national health program that would mean higher taxes?
Well, first off, it shouldn't need higher taxes because the program Senator Wofford is talking about would actually cost much less and not more. And whether or not it's radical, I don't think. Pennsylvania's not exactly been known as a hotbed of radical thought, Robin. But I think this is very much a message. It's very much a wake-up call. And I think if the president got the wake-up call at all, he rolled back over in the Lincoln bedroom because he just turned right around and took off on another overseas jaunt to address some foreign crisis instead of taking care of our own right here at home.
Ed Rollins, do you think there could be a national citizen mandate for national health insurance?
No, I don't think so. I think once people get into the topic and find out the cost, and I disagree with the other analysis, I mean, I think it's a very, very expensive proposition, and the vast majority of Americans would like a reduction in health care cost, and I don't think they want the taxpayers to have to foot the additional cost that'll come in a national debate about national health insurance. I think once the facts are out, it has a lot less appeal than it does just in the rhetoric of a campaign.
On the economy generally, which you said was the voters' #1 concern, what do you think the message is from Pennsylvania about the economy, and how does it translate into actions that Washington might take?
I think the people of Pennsylvania are very much like the people across the country. They're very, very concerned about their economic future, and they want their government, whether it be the president or the Congress or a senator or governor, to start doing something about it, to start taking some sort of steps that'll help stimulate this economy.
And does that translate into specific, the kinds of, I mean, there are many, like the, we had in the news summary just now, Senator Benson's tax cut proposal. I mean, is that what they want, things like that, or?
I think most Americans don't understand all the intricacies of economics or what goes on in Washington, but they want some action. And obviously some tax reduction would help stimulate the economy. And I think that it's foolish of us Republicans to let the Democrats get the lead on this issue that we've always been first and foremost on. Whatever makes the economy move forward as quickly as possible to put Americans back to work, is going to be the solution Americans are going to applaud.
Mr. Begala, what do you think the voters of Pennsylvania are saying they want done about the economy in kind of concrete terms? Do you have a sense of it?
Well, the sense I think Senator Wofford got from it is that they want the government to take care of the middle class again. That under Reagan and under Bush, the government responded surely and swiftly to take care of the very, very rich. And still today, President Bush is talking about a capital gains tax cut that will benefit only the very richest in our society. I think you're seeing in Senator Benson and other leading Democrats in this country a move to take America back to taking care of the middle class again. That was definitely the rallying cry of the Wofford campaign. So anything that stimulates the economy for the middle class, not just for the very rich, is what I think the voters are looking for, and it's clearly what they were looking for here in Pennsylvania.
Let me ask both of you finally and briefly. Ed Rollins is a very experienced campaign strategist and advisor. Obviously, a strongly argued message issue here was very influential. Does this mean, does it tell campaign strategists that issues are going to be back and that negative ads attacking the personality and character and record of opponents are going to be less influential than they have been in recent elections?
Well, issues are important. I don't think you should dismiss the fact that this campaign very cleverly put issues and put a negative message around those issues. They basically talked about Attorney General Thornburg being out of touch, and they used the issues to lay that out. There was a lot of negativism in this campaign. It was just a lot more subtly done.
Now, what do you see as the lesson for campaign managers growing out of your campaign, Mr. Begala?
Well, I think it is to argue for the middle class once again, that's where our party needs to be. And I think, frankly, Mr. Rollins is half right. The campaign was negative, but it was negative from the other side. Senator Wofford was talking about middle class issues. And can you imagine that we have an administration in Washington, a Republican Party, that thinks if a family makes $20,000 or $30,000 a year, they're so rich they shouldn't get a Pell Grant for their children to go to college. But a family making $330,000 a year is so poor that they need a capital gains tax cut?
I see. Well, Mr. Rollins and Mr. Begala, thank you both.
Thank you.
Judy?
And now to Gergen and Shields for their take on yesterday's results. David Gergen is the editor-at-large at U.S. News and World Report. Mark Shields is a syndicated columnist, and he joins us tonight from public station KUAT in Tucson, Arizona. Mark, do you agree with what you just heard, that Washington should heed the message that it should have heard from the Pennsylvania results?
Well, I think the election results from Pennsylvania were clearly a statement of revulsion and disgust with business as usual in Washington. I think it was a real slam at the administration, and we saw even before the returns were in from Pennsylvania, the president had announced this change in schedule, canceling a 2-week grand tour of the Orient, Judy, to forego foreign travel for domestic. So I think the message at least has been heeded at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue in some fashion. David, any disagreement with that?
Well, I do think the election in Pennsylvania was a political earthquake, measuring about 7 on the Richter scale. It's sending shockwaves through both political parties. I think there's a real danger that the Bush White House will draw the wrong lessons from this election. The danger, it seems to me, is that they will interpret this as being that Dick Thornburg was a poor message, but the message was all right. The message he had to sell was all right, and therefore, in the next election, what they ought to do, instead of being, he essentially went in and sat on his lead and didn't attack. And there are people in the Bush White House saying, if he'd only gone in and attacked, went on the offensive very early and kept Wofford on the mat, he would have won the election. And I don't think they're looking hard enough at the question of what Thornburg had to say about the future.
Well, we heard a little of that from Ed Rollins, who said tonight that Thornburg ran a terrible campaign, and he said that Wofford had run a brilliant campaign. You're saying that's what they're saying in the White House,
yeah, that's right.
too.
And it is true that Dick Thornburg, a terrifically good man, very decent man, did run a lousy campaign. It is also true he had nothing to offer about the future. He ran on the past. And the danger for the Bush White House is that they'll only go into 1992 running on the past. The Bush administration was an invisible candidate in this election. Its domestic program was. And this was a vote of no confidence in that domestic program. So what they need to do is come up with a growth package and a health care package for the future.
But you're saying you're not sure they got the message, and yet, as Mark just pointed out and was discussed before, the president has canceled his trip to Asia. His press secretary, Marlon Fitzwater, was saying last night or this morning, yes, we know the voters are concerned about the economy. I mean, there's some signals coming out of the White House.
Well, it's certainly true that they're taking it, they're paying more attention to the domestic agenda. But John Sununu, the chief of staff, was on television this weekend saying our problem is we've got some good proposals up there. They're just not well packaged. What we need to do is repackage what we have, what we've sent to the Congress, and that'll be fine. I don't think that's what the voters of Pennsylvania were saying at all. They were saying they're in trouble, they're distressed, they don't like what they're seeing, and it was the middle class. Democrats have voted for Reagan in the past. Moderate Republicans have deserted the Republican Party because they want action. They don't want just repackaging.
Mark, back to the questions that Robin was posing to Mr. Begala and to Ed Rollins. Is there something specific about what the voters are saying they want done, or is it just that they want action?
No, I think there is. I think that David's absolutely right. I think that the voters in Pennsylvania, first of all, Judy, the Wofford campaign was a brilliant campaign, make no mistake about that. And it puts the lie to what had become the conventional wisdom following Michael Dukakis' defeat by George Bush in 1988. And that was that somehow if Michael Dukakis had only answered the charges, he would have won. The reason Michael Dukakis didn't win was not that he didn't answer the charges, was that there wasn't a self-identification. He never identified who he was, what he stood for, and what his mission was. Harris Wofford did that. And he did it by saying he was there to represent people who pay the taxes, who do the work, who foot the bill, and who come up a little short at the end of the month after trying to save a couple of bucks. The middle class, just as David put it. And I think it comes down to health care. David has pointed out in the past, and I think accurately so, that the anxiety level of people losing their jobs has an awful lot to do with their losing their health care and the health coverage for their family. And I think that is real in America. Harris Wofford talked about real things that people talk about. Democratic liberals in the past have talked about things like how many caribou are going to be upset by the noise of a snowmobile somewhere. And he talked about things like whether, in fact, people can afford the price of college tuition and get the loans. A lot more people talk about that, Judy, than talk about whether they get the price of an abortion. And I think that's where the liberals have been in the past, and I think Harris Wofford addressed real concerns. That's the message. I don't know if the Democrats are going to get it. That's the key.
But to be fair, there were some Republican victories yesterday.
Sure.
The governorship of Mississippi, to both legislative houses in New Jersey. This was not an unmixed.
No, the Republicans had some victories. I think the Pennsylvania vote was the one that had the clearest national implications. But there was all through the country yesterday, in places where people voted, an anti-incumbent, anti-establishment, and indeed an anti-tax feeling. The anti-tax feeling does help Republicans in many states. It obviously helped them in New Jersey. You know, what was very striking in New Jersey, it seemed to me yesterday, is the ambivalence that voters do feel about some of these questions. On one hand, people were saying in New Jersey, we don't want our taxes raised, and we're voting against the Florio governorship who raised our taxes. On the other hand, there was a question on the ballot, do you want national health care? And people said yes by 3-1, they wanted national health care.
Well, you say it was anti-incumbent, David, and I know what you're saying, but in the state of Washington, they turned back a referendum initiative to limit terms for members of Congress and for state legislators.
Well, almost everywhere. Now, Washington, I think, on the term limitation thing, this term limitation movement is still rolling. A wheel came off the wagon yesterday in Washington State. And you have to give credit to Tom Foley and to others in the House of Representatives, the Democrats who went up there and campaigned against it. I think what they proved was, in a special case like Washington, they were able to make the argument in the last few days, if you, the voters of Washington, vote for term limits, where you're going to lose our delegation, we'll lose power in Washington, the state of California is going to take our water away from us, they're going to drill off our coast, your utility bills are going up. Very important.
Because the California congressional members would have more seniority.
They'd have more seniority. The other part of this is, and Jim Coyne, who's helping to run the term limitation movement in this country, points out that in Washington State, for the first time, the term limitation people put a retroactive clause into the ballot, so it in effect it personalized who was going to be hurt. Tom Foley was going to be voted out of Congress. And the other ones, the ones that have passed all around the country, have always been future-oriented, so you don't get this kind of hard charge that was very effectively waged by Tom Foley.
Mark, but would you agree with David that the term limit move is not dead, despite what happened in Washington State yesterday?
Well, I think the Washington state results, Judy, were a tribute to a masterful tactical campaign to rebut it. Attacking California. California's holding 1/8 of the membership of the House of Representatives, that Washington would lose its clout and its water with it. Didn't worry much about losing its clout, but losing its water was rather a fearful prospect for the people of Washington. And it was a tactical victory. If you ask them today, the voters, in favor of term limitations, I think you'd get they still like to see term limitations, but on this basis, the argument was made not against the theory or the idea or the value of term limitations, but against their consequences. If you're close enough to New York or California, I guess you can use that in a smaller state.
What about, I want to ask you both about the Mississippi governor's race. Here you had a Republican win who is espousing many of the same views we're hearing from David Duke, the Republican candidate for governor over in Louisiana. Now, the Mississippi winner is not somebody who's a former member of the Ku Klux Klan, but he is saying some of the same things. does this say anything about what may happen in Louisiana on November 16th, David?
I think that David Duke looks like a very formidable candidate in Louisiana, and it would not at all be surprised. In fact, I think at the moment he'll probably win. He's running a little bit ahead in the public polls, and traditionally his public poll numbers below his actual count. What's happened here is that the Republicans have faced, both in Louisiana and in Mississippi, two Harvard-trained young tigers, came in as governors, Mavis in Mississippi, Buddy Roemer in Louisiana, and they've run up against the good old boy network, and right now the good old boys are winning. And for the Republicans, what this means is they are strengthening their hold by taking the Mississippi governorship the first time in over 100 years. They're strengthening their hold in the Sun Belt, and that's important for the future of the Republican Party.
But Mark, what about Louisiana?
Well, Louisiana is an absolute minefield for the Republicans. I think the president did the right thing today, morally, by saying he would vote for Edwin Edwards. I'm not sure if it hurts David Duke politically. David Duke, make no mistake about it, George Wallace got religion late in his life. He became a very formidable healing factor in Alabama in his last two terms. But George Wallace was nothing compared to David Duke. David Duke is smoother, he's cooler, he's more appealing, he's more attractive. Yes, he has a biography that haunts him, but he is a terrifying prospect to the Republicans, as well as to the people of Louisiana, who are concerned about future economic growth. I mean, how do you persuade a company to transplant to Louisiana with David Duke in the governorship? And I think that's a concern. But this, again, comes back to the economic downturn, the pain that people are feeling in this recession. It's just ripe for social dynamite in the kind that David Duke is offering.
All right. David Gergen, Mark Shields, thank you both. Robin?
Still ahead on the NewsHour, the Supreme Court hears a school prayer case, and the feds get tough on food labeling. Next tonight, new questions about the constitutional line that separates religion and government. The Supreme Court began a fresh examination of that line today as the justices heard a case that revisits the issue of school prayer in public schools. Correspondent Kwame Holman has our report.
We bow our heads, we speak the Lord's Prayer. Our Father, who art in heaven.
It was a widespread practice until the 1960s. Children in public schools prayed, directed by school officials. The prayers usually reflected the dominant Protestant faith of the nation.
In a school environment, to have a religious exercise that is sponsored by the school and endorsed by the school is inconsistent with the principle of separation of church and state, because it sends a message to the students that the school, the government, supports and endorses religion, perhaps favors a particular religion.
That basically was the reasoning behind the Supreme Court's 1962 decision that prohibited classroom prayer led by public school officials.
Please stand for a moment of silence.
But spiritual expressions still exist in public schools. At the Nathan Bishop Middle School in Providence, Rhode Island, the day begins with the Pledge of Allegiance, including its reference to God, and with a Supreme Court-approved moment of silence, during which children may pray on their own. Though many of the students here aren't aware of it, their school is the backdrop for a Supreme Court case that could lead to new rules on government's role in religion. The case springs from a complaint by Daniel Weissman, whose daughter was part of the bishop graduation ceremony 5 years ago. The Weissmans are Jewish.
At her graduation, there was an invocation and a benediction given by a minister who was particularly enthusiastic. He had the audience rise, and we all stood up, and then had us give a moment of silence to thank Jesus Christ for the accomplishments of the children that day. We stood and had a moment of silence. We were instructed to pray to Jesus, and then he probably said a few more words, I can't recall, and we sat. As a non-Christian, it was an affront and an extremely inappropriate imposition of a religion that's not mine on me.
Published in the Journal Weissman, a professor of social work at Rhode Island College, complained to school officials about the graduation prayer, then let the matter rest. But 3 years later, when his younger daughter was a graduate in this ceremony, he reminded them of his discomfort with a graduation prayer.
Eventually, we got a message from the teacher in charge of graduation informing us that good news, we have a rabbi, you'll have somebody of your own faith at the graduation, and you won't be uncomfortable this time. We weren't looking for a squeaky wheel treatment here. We were really looking for this practice to be curtailed, at least for the year that we're up, but maybe if they're really interested in being the kind of school that they say they are, they shouldn't do this at all.
To that end, the Weissmans challenged the rabbi's graduation prayer in a federal court. In January 1990, the court ruled in their favor, saying because the prayer was arranged for by school officials, it violated the ban on government involvement in religion contained in the First Amendment. That so-called establishment clause says the Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. The prayer, which used the words God and Amen only once, was a violation, the court wrote, because current Supreme Court doctrine essentially means God has been ruled out of public education as an instrument of inspiration or consolation.
The invocation benedictions here have been a tradition for many, many years.
School Board Chairman Vincent McWilliams says that tradition is one reason the Providence schools appealed to the Supreme Court after a second federal court upheld the ban on the graduation prayer.
We didn't look at it in the context of being anything religious relative to the issue. At the same token, we felt ourselves being placed almost in a role that anybody that came to a graduation ceremony, not necessarily a member of the clergy, but any speaker that happened to be giving a speech and should ever mention the deity, we would be in violation of a federal court ruling.
It's our view that the framers of the First Amendment had no intention of prohibiting the expression of religious beliefs at civic ceremonies of this kind.
Washington, D.C. Attorney Charles Cooper represented the Providence schools before the Supreme Court this morning.
Intent and the meaning of the Establishment Clause was not to eliminate references to God from public life. If that is the case, then the simple reference to God in Rabbi Gutterman's invocation will have, and its removal from the graduation ceremony will have to be followed by, we believe, similar eliminations of religious sentiments from presidential inaugurations, from the opening of legislative sessions, from things like the Pledge of Allegiance and the national motto, which is "In God We Trust."
Let us pray. With grateful hearts, O God, we express our
religious references by government indeed are common today and stretch back to the time of the framing of the Constitution. During arguments before the High Court today, one justice, David Souter, noted the graduation prayer case pits that tradition against newer Supreme Court interpretations designed to protect religious minorities. But American Civil Liberties Union President Nadine Strawson says the Supreme Court's current standard, as articulated by Justice O'Connor, is adequate for the graduation prayer case.
The question that the court asks is, does the government, through this particular action, convey a message of endorsing or disfavoring religion? That question is obviously going to vary. The answer to that question will vary depending on the circumstances. I think it's less likely that a reasonable person would see the phrase "In God We Trust" on coins as being government endorsement of religion. That seems to me less likely than that a reasonable person attending a graduation ceremony of a public school would perceive a government-sponsored prayer by a member of the clergy selected by the government to be an endorsement of religion. I think the facts are distinguishable.
The High Court's decision could affect more than school ceremonies. Chief Justice Rehnquist and 4 other justices have indicated they would like to devise a new legal test to determine where government must draw the line in matters of religion. The Bush administration Justice Department has joined the Weissman case on the side of the Providence schools. Both are asking the court to prohibit religious activities only when they amount to government coercion toward religion. Outside the Supreme Court this morning, many hoped the justice's decision next year will settle conflicting lower court opinions on graduation prayer and similar cases. But one lawyer said no court can devise a clear, bright line that will separate religion and government.
Next tonight, the news on food labeling. The Food and Drug Administration announced today sweeping new regulations. Charlene Hunter-Gault has the story. Charlene?
In the simplest terms, what the FDA proposed today would make it possible to judge a food by its label. Some 77,000 types of food and more than 250,000 food labels will be affected. All but the smallest mom-and-pop stores in the $250 billion food industry will be affected by this sweeping new plan. For more details now, we turn to the head of the FDA, Dr. David Kessler. Dr. Kessler, why was this change necessary?
Put yourself in the place of the average consumer. When I walk into the supermarket, what do you see? The claims are very confusing and conflicting. Words have to have meaning. They have to reflect what's actually in the product. What this is all about is really comes down to honesty in the marketplace, truth in labeling.
What do you hope to achieve with this, and what will be the benefit to the consumer?
Confidence in the food label. So when you see a product is labeled and it says low fat, it means low fat. What's actually in the product bears a resemblance to what the claim is made.
Dr. Lewis Sullivan, as you know, head of Health and Human Services today, talked about cost savings in health and so on. Is that really what you're expecting?
Well, I think that there is an enormous opportunity to affect our own lives. Each of us have the ability to influence our health through our diet, how we exercise. What's the role of government? Our role is not to tell people what to eat, not to eat this food or that food. The role of government is to make sure that people have accurate information that is truthful, that tells the whole story.
All right, one of the biggest changes you're making has to do with the nutritional information that's listed on the package of food. Tell me a little bit about why you're making this change and how much more information you're going to put on there.
Well, first of all, the nutrition panel, nutrition information. Right now, only about 60% of products have that information. It's essentially voluntary. Under the new proposals, virtually all foods will have mandatory nutrition information, and it will be more useful. It will contain information about fat, about saturated fat, about cholesterol, the things that we're concerned about today.
Those things are not on there now?
No.
Any other additional information that'll be on there that is?
Well, we're going to take off some of the things that used to be on the label. Riboflavin, niacin, thiamine. Those were ingredients that we worried about 50 years ago, about diseases like beriberi. Today, we're worried about things like cancer and heart disease. So we've really updated the food label.
All right, now you're also going to do some changes in product labeling, specifically the strict definitions governing the use of certain words and phrases. For example, using the term light must have 1/3 fewer calories than the products they're being compared to. Products labeled low fat must have no more than 3 grams of fat per serving, and products claiming to have less of an ingredient, as in less salt, must reduce that ingredient by 25%. Now, I've sort of laid out that. Explain that to me in the simplest of terms.
Up to now, manufacturers could decide what to put on the label. They could decide whether the product was light, whether the product was low fat. Under these proposals, there are definitions, there are standards, and if the product doesn't meet that standard, the company can't use it. They can't come up with their own terms. If we haven't defined the terms, the company has 2 choices: either don't use it or work with us to get it defined.
All right, we have a couple of specific examples I'd like you to comment on. For example, the kinds of information that would change under these regulations. this frozen dinner item claims to be 95% fat-free. The back panel shows there are 8 grams of fat for each serving, and there are 260 calories per serving. What would they have to change about the way they've labeled this product?
When you see a percent fat-free claim, it says 95% fat-free, you say, gee, this product must be good for me. But yet, a product like that would not meet our definition of low fat. And we're not going to permit, because that product has